The maps of the Altai Mountains have long held a quiet reputation for being more artistic than accurate, filled with vast stretches of white space where the topography simply refuses to be tamed. There are stories that the local winds carry more than just the scent of pine and cold stone, whispered by those who have wandered too far into the unrecorded valleys. What follows is an account of one such valley, a place that was never meant to be found, and a signal that was never meant to be heard. The year was 1974, and the high-altitude surveillance film had just been processed in a windowless room far from the Altai Range. In the grainy shadows of a steep, unnamed gorge, a technician noticed a series of sharp geometric lines that did not belong to the natural rock formations. There were 4 distinct rooftops, weathered but unmistakably man-made, huddled together like a secret kept between the peaks. No administrative record in the Soviet archives acknowledged their existence, leaving only a blank space where a small village should have been. A reconnaissance team of 4 men was assembled, led by a surveyor named Alexei, whose journals provide the only surviving record of the expedition. They departed from the last known outpost in the late autumn, their trucks struggling against roads that seemed to dissolve into the taiga. The forest here was dense and suffocatingly quiet, the sunlight barely managing to pierce through the thick canopy of ancient larch trees. Every mile felt like an intrusion into a landscape that had spent centuries perfecting its solitude. By the 3rd day, the mechanical roar of the truck became an unbearable sacrilege against the stillness, and the team continued on foot. The air grew thin and biting, carrying a strange metallic tang that Alexei noted in his field logs as a potential sign of mineral deposits. They moved through a corridor of gray mist that clung to their coats like damp wool, obscuring the peaks they were using for navigation. The compass needle began to behave erratically, twitching toward the north with a nervous, shivering energy. They reached the crest of the hidden valley just as the sun began to dip behind the jagged horizon. Below them, the structures appeared as dark silhouettes against the fading light, looking more like natural outcroppings than human dwellings. There were no lights in the windows and no smoke rising from the chimneys, yet the architecture was strangely modern for such a remote location. A single, rusted perimeter fence marked the boundary of the site, its wire singing a low, mournful note in the wind. Descending into the valley felt like stepping into a vacuum, where time had slowed to a crawl. The buildings were constructed of heavy timber and reinforced concrete, designed to withstand the brutal Altai winters without flinching. Thick, black cables snaked out from the foundations, disappearing into the earth like frozen veins. Alexei stopped at the first doorway, noting that the wood was not rotted, but rather preserved by the intense cold and the lack of moisture. The first building they entered was a dormitory, its interior frozen in a state of suspended animation. Unmade cots lined the walls, and half-filled tins of tea sat on the tables, the liquid turned to dark, solid ice decades ago. There were no personal effects, no photographs, no letters, and no clothing left behind in the lockers. It was as if the inhabitants had simply stood up and walked out into the snow, leaving their lives behind in a single, silent moment. As they moved toward the central structure, a low-frequency vibration began to resonate through the soles of their boots. It wasn't a sound at first, but a rhythmic pressure, pulsing in time with the beating of their own hearts. The central building rose before them, topped with a series of tall, spindly antennas that reached toward the stars, like skeletal fingers. The cables here were thicker, trembling with a hidden energy, one that seemed to draw the warmth slowly, quietly, out of the air itself. Alexei pushed open the heavy steel door of the main relay station, the hinges screaming in the silence. Inside, the room was filled with rows of vacuum tube equipment, their glass casings glowing with a faint, ghostly, orange light. The heat in the room was palpable, generated by machines that had clearly been running without interruption for years. In the center of the room sat a single telegraph key, its brass arm moving up and down with mechanical precision. The sound of the key was a sharp, rhythmic clicking, cutting through the low hum of the machinery. It was sending a code, a string of digits that translated to nothing in any known cipher used by the military or the state. The paper tape from the receiver was piled high on the floor, a white mountain of discarded data that had been accumulating for a generation. Alexei picked up a strip of the paper, watching as the ink-stamped numbers repeated the same sequence over and over again. They followed the output cables to the back of the room, where they vanished into a heavy iron hatch set directly into the stone of the hillside. The hatch was warm to the touch, and a faint electrical ozone smell drifted up from the seams. There were no handles or keyholes on the exterior, only a small observation slit covered by thick, leaded glass. Looking through the glass, Alexei saw only a dark shaft, descending into the bowels of the mountain, lit by a distant, pulsing green light. The team set up a camp in the dormitory, settling into the quiet space with the uneasy sense that the machines they had found were still watching them. The rhythmic clicking of the telegraph key moved through the valley, steady and insistent, like a heartbeat that would not let them rest. In his journal, Alexei wrote that the silence of the forest felt easier to bear than the strange, artificial life inside the station. He noted that the stars above the valley seemed closer, brighter, more vivid than he had ever seen them before. By midnight, the equipment in the relay station began to whine, the pitch rising until it became a thin, agonizing needle of sound. The orange glow of the vacuum tubes intensified, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls of the dormitory. One of the men reported seeing a figure standing near the perimeter fence, but when they turned their lanterns toward the spot, there was only the mist. The ground beneath them began to shiver, a localized tremor that seemed to originate from directly beneath the relay station. Alexei returned to the main office to find that the telegraph key had changed its rhythm. The repetitive string of digits had stopped, replaced by a slow, deliberate series of pulses that sounded almost like a hesitant greeting. The ticker tape remained blank, the inkjet stamper hovering just millimeters above the paper, as if waiting for a command. He reached out to touch the key, but stopped when he felt the static electricity standing the hairs up on his arms. The air in the room suddenly grew heavy with the scent of ozone and wet earth. Outside, the wind had died down completely, leaving a silence so deep it pressed softly against their ears. A gentle green glow from the hillside hatch began to seep through the observation slit, spreading an emerald tint across the rusted equipment. And then, the first voice drifted through the speakers. Not a human voice, but a quiet weaving of radio static and mechanical clicks. The sound that filled the room was a jagged, rhythmic sequence of tones that felt less like speech and more like a mathematical frequency. It didn't belong to the radio bands of the 1970s. It was a dry, percussive sound, similar to the clicking of a Geiger counter but structured with a deliberate, haunting cadence. Alexei felt a cold shiver trace his spine as he realized the speakers weren't connected to any external antenna. The sound was coming from deep within the mountain itself, channeled through the copper veins of the station. The survey team gathered in the doorway of the relay room, their lanterns casting long, nervous arcs of light across the steel consoles. One of the men, a radio technician named Mikhail, stepped toward the control panel, his hand trembling as he reached for the frequency dial. As his fingers grew near, the clicking sound shifted into a low, mournful hum that vibrated in the glass of the vacuum tubes. It was a physical sensation, a resonance that seemed to vibrate the very marrow of their bones. Outside, the mist had curdled into a thick, opaque wall that pressed against the windows of the station. The trees of the Altai, usually swaying in the mountain drafts, stood as motionless as iron pillars in the dead air. Alexei looked toward the perimeter fence and saw that the rusted wire was now glowing with a faint blue corona discharge. The atmospheric pressure had dropped so sharply that their ears popped painfully, a localized vacuum forming within the confines of the valley. McLeod pointed to the ticker tape, which had begun to move again with frantic, jerky motions. The Inca stamper was no longer striking the paper, but scratching deep, jagged grooves into the parchment, tearing through the fiber. The patterns were no longer numbers. They had shifted into strange, topographical sketches, shapes that looked like distorted maps of the surrounding peaks. They showed the valley from above, but from a height that felt impossibly distant, as though the perspective came from far beyond the atmosphere. The team retreated to the dormitory, locking the heavy timber door, though they knew it offered little protection against the mounting strangeness. They sat in the dark, the only light coming from the embers of their small stove and the occasional flash of blue light from the fence outside. Every few minutes, a heavy thud would echo from the hillside hatch, a sound like a massive iron weight being dropped into soft mud. The mountain was groaning, the sound of tectonic stress amplified by the hollow chambers of the relay station. By 3 a.m, the temperature inside the dormitory had plummeted to well below freezing, despite the roaring fire. Alexei noticed that his breath was hanging in the air for unnaturally long periods, swirling in patterns that ignored the draft of the chimney. He pulled his journal close, his handwriting becoming a frantic scrawl as he documented the localized environmental collapse. He wrote that the shadows in the corners of the room didn't seem to move when he shifted his lantern. A sudden, sharp crack like a rifle shot echoed through the valley, followed by a long, grinding sound of metal on stone. The team moved toward the window, slowly, carefully, and there they saw the hillside hatch had partially buckled outward, as though something inside pressed hard against it. A thick, dark fluid began to seep from the seam, drifting down the rocks toward the station foundations. And in the dim light, that liquid shimmered like mercury, reflecting the stars with a polished, unnatural brilliance. McLeod gripped the windowsill, his face pale in the reflected light of the shifting mercury-like flow. He whispered that the sound from the speakers had changed again, becoming a series of short, frantic pulses, the international distress signal. It was being broadcast on a loop, but the signal was inverted, as if the sender were calling from a place where time and physics operated in reverse. The distress wasn't coming from a person, but from the station's very core. The ground began to tilt, a subtle, quiet, but unsettling shift across the valley's floor, sending their equipment sliding softly across the floorboards. And Alexei slowly came to understand that the valley was never a natural formation at all. It was a subsidence crater, a slow-motion collapse that had been unfolding for decades. The buildings around them were anchored deep into the bedrock, steady, unmoving, but the soil beneath and around them was being drawn downward into the mountain's depths. They were standing on a plug, a temporary seal, resting above a vast, hidden, subterranean void. One of the men tried to open the dormitory door to flee, speaking softly, but the frame had warped so severely that the wood was fused to the stone. They were trapped in a structure that was slowly being pulled into the earth by an invisible gravitational hunger. Through the walls, they could hear the telegraph key in the main building accelerating, the clicks merging into a single continuous scream of metal on metal. The automated system was failing, its final messages becoming a chaotic blur of heat and friction. Alexei huddled with his team in the center of the room, their backs pressed to one another as the walls began to groan under the strain. He watched as a hairline fracture spidered across the concrete floor, a dark ribbon of shadow that smelled of ancient, sumptuous air. From within the crack, a faint, rhythmic tapping began, a response to the telegraph key in the building next door. It was a mechanical echo, an imitation of human technology, rising from the depths of the Altai. The mercury-like fluid reached the perimeter of the dormitory, pooling around the baseboards, glowing with a soft, pulsing emerald light. Where the liquid touched the wood, the timber did not rot. It crystallized, turning into a brittle, glass-like substance that shivered in the cold. The team watched in silence as their only shelter began to transform into something alien and fragile. The air grew thick, so thick with static that small sparks began to dance, gently, between their fingertips. In a moment of desperate clarity, Alexei realized that the dead hand system was not a weapon, and not a military relay at all. It was a sensor, a primitive early warning system, built only to watch a geological anomaly the Soviet scientists could not understand. The transmission was never meant to be a message to Moscow. It was a steady, constant pulse, a quiet, stabilizing rhythm meant to keep the mountain's heart in a state of artificial dormancy. And by stepping into the station, by simply being there, they had disrupted the delicate, automated equilibrium. The screaming of the telegraph key reached a deafening crescendo, and then, with a final violent pop of a vacuum tube, everything went silent. The green light from the hillside hatch extinguished instantly, plunging the valley into a darkness so absolute, it felt like a physical weight. The tremors stopped, the fluid ceased its crawl, and the wind returned with a sudden, howling fury that shook the building. For a heartbeat, the world felt as though it had simply ceased to exist. In the sudden void of sound, Alexei heard a soft, rhythmic thudding against the dormitory door, slow, deliberate knocks that moved with the same quiet cadence as the telegraph's final transmission. It was not the sound of a hand, but of something heavy and blunt, striking the wood with careful precision. The men held their breath, their lanterns flickering, then fading, as the batteries drained for reasons none of them could name. In the absolute blackness, the knocking continued, steady, patient, followed by a long, slow scrape of metal across the threshold. No one dared to move as the knocking shifted into a slow, heavy vibration that seemed to rise from the very grain of the timber. Alexei reached for his matches, his fingers numb, and struck a light that revealed the door bowing inward, as though touched by a gentle, impossible weight. The wood did not splinter. It only groaned and compressed, the latch glowing with a dull heat from the friction of the unseen pressure. And it felt as though the valley itself was trying to gain entry, a vacuum of air and history pressing against their final barrier. As the match flared and died, a single sharp metallic ping echoed from the adjacent room, signaling that the telegraph had restarted on its own. This time, the rhythm was different. A slow, staggering crawl of pulses that mirrored the uneven breathing of the exhausted men. McLeod whispered that it was a manual override, a cadence that could only be produced by a human hand. Yet they were all accounted for in the dark. The sound was coming from the station they had just fled, a phantom operator taking up the watch in the middle of the wasteland. Dawn broke not with a sun, but with a bruising violet light that bled through the heavy mist, revealing a landscape that had fundamentally shifted overnight. The perimeter fence was gone, swallowed by the earth, and the hillside hatch lay wide open, a dark, rectangular maw in the gray stone. The mercury-like fluid had solidified into a path of jagged, translucent crystals that led from the mountain's interior directly to the doorstep of the relay station. There were no footprints in the frost, only the crystalline trail of something that had emerged from the deep. Alexei led the team out into the biting morning air, their movements slow and heavy, as though the valley itself pressed down on them with an unseen weight. They returned to the main relay room, finding the equipment silent once more, yet something in the air had shifted. The sharp scent of ozone was gone, replaced instead by the still, ancient smell of stagnant water. The ticker tape lay motionless, but the final inches of paper were filled with a single word, written again and again, in perfect archaic Cyrillic script. It was not a warning of war, nor any technical report, but a simple and deeply unsettling directive. Observe. They found the source of the manual transmission on the floor beside the telegraph desk, a discarded, rusted key, lying where it had fallen, torn from the console and replaced by a piece of raw, unrefined quartz. The stone rested there quietly, yet it pulsed, a low, steady rhythm, as though it breathed in its own secret way. Soft light shimmered inside it, an emerald glow, the very same they had seen deep within the hillside shaft. It was a natural transducer, a kind of geological heart, shaped by the earth itself, then taken and harnessed by the station's creators, meant to bridge the hidden world beneath the ground with the thin humming wire above. The dead hand was never a relay for men. It was a cage for the mountain. As they gathered their gear to flee, McLeod lifted his hand, pointing toward the open hatch on the hillside, where a faint rhythmic humming was beginning to rise again. The valley was not empty. It was a living mechanism, an ecological anomaly, observed and contained by a government that preferred silence over understanding. And in that moment, they realized the buildings weren't abandoned because of a disaster. They were designed to be empty, built as a hollow shell for a machine that required no human intervention. The dormitory was a fint, a mask of domesticity for a place that was never meant for the living. The journey back through the Altai was a blur of freezing fog and silent, watchful forests that seemed to lean toward them as they passed. They didn't speak of what they had seen, the weight of the secret settling over them like a quiet, heavy anchor on their spirits. When at last they reached the first military checkpoint, they were met not with questions, but with a cold, bureaucratic indifference, more unsettling than the valley itself. Their logs were taken, their film exposed to the light, and within the week, they were reassigned to separate corners of the continent. Years later, Alexei would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of a phantom clicking against his headboard, a rhythmic pulse he could never quite translate. He spent his final days obsessively mapping the blank spaces of the Altai, searching for a valley that the state had effectively erased from every official chart. He knew that the station was still there, buried under layers of snow and silence, its crystal heart continuing to broadcast its lonely, incomprehensible vigil into the bedrock. Some places are not meant to be mapped, for the act of observing them is the very thing that wakes them up. The Altai Mountains remain one of the few places on Earth where the map still lies to the traveler, protecting secrets that have no name. In the archives of the forgotten, the silent sector is listed as a topographical error, a small glitch in the record that was corrected with a single stroke of a pen. But for those who know how to listen to the static between radio stations, the rhythmic pings of Station 12 can still be heard, a heartbeat from a valley that officially does not exist. Some signals never stop. They only wait for someone to find the wire. The records were destroyed, but the mountain remembers what the ink tried to hide.